They're back. The first parliamentary week of the year. We break down new Speaker Peter Slipper's performance and speak to one of the ministers who had to sit through it. Plus, we ask the minister about Polly's pay. It's gone up. How does he justify it? Hello and welcome to Showdown. I'm Peter van Onselen. Well, it started. The parliamentary year for 2012 got off with a bit of a bang, I suppose. Today, first sitting day of the new parliamentary calendar, we had Peter Slipper taking the Speaker's chair. We had the discussion in Parliament on the back of a poll this week out in the Fairfax papers, the AC Nielsen polling. And, of course, we then could assess the performances of the relative leaders. Tony Abbott didn't come out swinging as hard as he has previously. Now, the opinion polling, which we've got up on screen, shows that the Labor Party, according to AC Nielsen, has picked up its vote. It's at 33% now. Some Labor people were hailing that as a great victory. I see it as a defeat, just not as bad as some of the earlier polling. There is a trend there, I suppose, if there are some more examples of this in coming polls. But the risk, of course, for the Prime Minister is that these results, including the two-party result, are still landslide results. There needs to be momentum building on the back of this one poll. If AC Nielsen comes back when it next polls, and they usually poll every couple of months, if it's not good, the government's got a problem. When the news poll comes out next week, if it's not good, the government's got a problem as well. That's the negatives from today's parliamentary performance for the government. But the positive, I suppose, is that the new Speaker, Peter Slipper, did a pretty good job in the Speaker's chair. Now, he's been mocked, including by the Daily Telegraph today, as well as when he first got the title, as a rat. The imagery shows him up as a rat today. The discussion was that he would get all pompous on us and look to wear the garb of a bygone era. Well, he decided to don the coat, or the cape, I should say, but he didn't put the wig on, fortunately for him, fortunately for us. But on his performance, as opposed to the parody of the man, he did pretty well. And he's to be given a certain amount of credit for that, I would suggest. Now, something where somebody didn't do so well was the Prime Minister in a brochure that she put out to her electorate. Now, this brochure, which we've got a copy of, we'll put it up on screen, you can't read the writing on it, but trust me, I think it's the second or the third image from the left of your screen, talks about hailing the greatness of the Labor Party in terms of bringing in the aged pension when it was first in government in 1909. Well, Labor was first in government in 1904. And in fact, it didn't bring in the age pension. That was brought in 1908, not even 1909, and it was brought in by the Deakin government, not even a Labor government. Now, that is just one of many errors on this brochure that the Prime Minister signed off on and put out in her own electoral backyard in Victoria. Now, Troy Bramston, who does a whole range of things for Sky, and he's also a regular columnist in The Australian. He's got an article on this in tomorrow's Australian where he, as a Labor historian, goes into quite some detail about just how many errors there were in this brochure. It wasn't just a case of what The Australian reported today by her leaving out Kevin Rudd, which I assume was intentional. She left out Gough Whitlam, she left out a range of other significant moments in Labor's history, and more importantly, the ones that she did refer to, she got them wrong. On this program of Showdown, as mentioned off the top, we'll be speaking to Gary Gray, Labor Minister, Special Minister for State, and we'll be talking to him about, amongst other things, politicians' pay increases. But we'll also be speaking first up to Julie Bishop, the Deputy Leader of the Opposition and also Shadow Foreign Affairs spokesperson. I want to talk to her about what's going on over in Syria, but also, obviously, what's going on at home. Labor are really trying to make some mileage out of economic divisions within the coalition and also problems over costings. We'll put those to her. And later in the program, it is a rainbow of options tonight. We've also got Adam Bant from the Greens. No suggestions of bias here. We're taking the full spectrum of Australian politics. We'll talk to Adam Bant, partly about the question that he asked today in Question Time about dental care and whether he was comfortable with the Prime Minister's answer, and we'll also look to have a chat to him more widely about health issues, as well as Bob Brown's comments yesterday where he accused the media of sexism for going after Julia Gillard the way that some of us have. We'll see exactly what he thinks his leader meant about that. All that coming up on Showdown, but first, let's take a look at what's making news with Michael Willesee. We've had some tweets coming in about the revelation about Julia Gillard's brochure going out with incorrect details to her electorate. Some people saying it's a beat-up, another News Limited hack beat-up, others saying how typical of this Prime Minister that she can't even get those sort of basics right. We might ask the first guest that we've got about that, but more accurately, we're probably going to go straight to Syria and on to some discussions about economic policies when we come back from the break, speaking to the Deputy Leader of the Opposition and Shadow Foreign Affairs spokesperson, Julie Bishop. Back in a moment.
In addition to the sanctions we have already imposed on Syria, Australia will impose further autonomous financial sanctions and travel bans on 75 Syrian individuals and 27 entities not already listed by Australia.
That's Kevin Rudd, the Foreign Minister. We're all talking about leadership speculation with him vis-a-vis Julia Gillard, but that's him getting on with the job as Foreign Minister and talking about what Australia's response is to the, I guess, civil war in Syria at the moment. And to talk about that as well, we're joined by Kevin Rudd's opposite, Julie Bishop, the Shadow Foreign Affairs spokeswoman and also the Deputy Leader of the Opposition. Ms Bishop, thank you very much for your company on Showdown.
Good evening, Peter. Good to be with you.
Can I just ask you on this matter of Syria? I mean, we've all seen the images, we've seen the government's response. Is the opposition on the same page as the government, or is there more that you'd like to see happen?
We're certainly supporting the government's actions to date, the sanctions that have already been imposed and the sanctions that the Foreign Minister announced today. We support the Arab League resolution to the Security Council, which disturbingly and regrettably has been double vetoed by Russia and China, and the Australian government also supported that resolution. We believe that there is more that other countries can do. We would like to see more countries imposing sanctions even outside the UN framework, as Australia has done. But the violence must stop. There must be an end to the bloodshed. There has been virtually universal condemnation of the Assad regime, and the best option would be for Assad to stand aside and allow a civilian government to take its place.
Back on domestic matters, not quite in the same league, obviously, as what's going on in Syria, but in terms of Peter Slipper, he took the chair of the speakership, I suppose, in the lower house. I've been pretty critical of him and his decision to rat on your side of politics and become an independent speaker, but he did a pretty good job today, didn't he?
Peter Slipper has experience in the Speaker's role, and I certainly have no complaints about the way he handled question time today. But the bigger issue is that the Prime Minister closed down question time today after only 4 questions from the opposition. Now, there is no time limit to question time, yet only after 4 questions, the Prime Minister ran away from any further scrutiny by the opposition. So it was a pretty bad question time for Julia Gillard and the government. And I think Peter Slipper performed the role as you would expect. One
of the pieces of information that happened right in the middle of question time at 2:30 was the revelation that the Reserve Bank, contrary to what a lot of economists expected, they did not drop interest rates. Now, I realise that the Reserve Bank is independent of government, but nonetheless, you can express an opinion on this. Would you have liked to have seen interest rates come down?
I think there are many Australians who are doing it tough. Small businesses with the interest rates that they're wearing, mortgage holders, of course, lower interest rates are in people's interests, and that's what they would want to see. But the economy is slowing, and there was real evidence of that by the fact that in 2011 it was the first year for 20 years, probably since the recession that Labor said we had to have back in 1992, that there was no net jobs growth in Australia. First time in 20 years. And that gives us an indication of how difficult things can be for people. But, Peter, this also underscores the fact that it's the worst time for the Australian government to be imposing an economy-wide carbon tax, which will drive up the cost of living, drive up electricity costs and cause job losses across the economy.
Just on that issue of the carbon tax, I mean, the government aren't going to look to do this under Julia Gillard's leadership, but you never know if there was a change of leader to Kevin Rudd. Is the carbon tax that bad if they were to reduce the starting price? In other words, have it have a significantly less impact on the economy along the lines that you're talking about?
But, Peter, given that no comparable economy is imposing an economy-wide carbon tax, it puts Australia at a competitive disadvantage. And we've now seen the Treasury modelling, which shows that there will be a hit to our GDP by 2020, there will be a loss in real wages and job losses. Now, this is Treasury modelling.
But that's kind of my point, though. If they reduce the size of the initial fixed price, assumingly then when it becomes an ETS, you know, the price will plummet anyway. Wouldn't that be a way of kind of getting around the concerns that the opposition and some sections of business have about the carbon tax?
We don't believe that there is any need at all to introduce a carbon tax. We believe that there are other ways of reducing emissions, and we know that this carbon tax will not reduce emissions. In fact, they will increase under the imposition of a carbon tax. So there is no environmental gain from this carbon tax. It's just a wealth redistribution. This government's not interested in wealth creation. All it's interested in is wealth redistribution. So you made the point, could there be a change to the carbon tax? Obviously not under Julia Gillard, but whether they change leaders and the new leader changes policies, we'll have to wait and see. But I'm sure you'll be asking me about the leadership speculation within the Labor Party.
We will definitely get to that before we get to the end. But first I want to talk about some of the concerns that the government are at least trying to ramp up about coalition costings. Now, I've just got a clip I just want to quickly show of Joe Hockey answering to this idea of whether or not the coalition will get to a surplus. If we could just play it.
As we said at the last election, based on the information and numbers provided at the last election, we absolutely stand by the commitment to have a surplus next year.
Julie Bishop, that's no commitment. As per the numbers of the last election, we all know that those numbers have already changed from the MyEFO from last year, much less throwing in what's going to happen in the next budget in May. This is an example, isn't it, of the coalition trying to appear like it's sticking to its pledge to get to a surplus, but preparing to be able to break it based on the numbers changing.
Well, Peter, can I assure you that we will get to a surplus before Wayne Swan gets to a surplus?
But you don't think he's ever going to get to a surplus?
Before we call the coalition to account on a budget surplus, have a look at what's happened to Labor's estimates of a budget surplus. They started off with a deficit this year of $12 billion. Then they revised it to $27 billion deficit. Now it's a $37 billion deficit. So there are 2 budgets to go before the next election. Let's see what Wayne Swan comes up with in 2012 and 2013. But I can assure you we have a track record of delivering surpluses. In fact, I was a member of a government that delivered 7 successive budget surpluses. And having listened to Julia Gillard and Kevin Rudd and Wayne Swan say that they're committed to budget surpluses, yet in their 4 budgets, the total cumulative deficits are $167 billion. No one will believe anything they say about delivering a budget surplus. It's just not in their capacity to do it.
What about the working order of the finance side of the coalition, though? I mean, all the rumours are that Andrew Robb and Joe Hockey don't get on particularly well. I've heard a lot of criticism from both the business community and even some of your colleagues that I've spoken to about Joe Hockey's performance of late, including his performance on Q&A last night. In your view, I mean, this is a portfolio that you've held, and might I say you relinquished it based on some pretty minor sort of missteps along the way in comparison to some of the criticism now coming at Joe Hockey. As Deputy Leader, you've got the right to take it back. Why wouldn't you do that?
I'm exceedingly happy in my portfolio as Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs. Of course, I would like to be the Minister for Foreign Affairs. That is most certainly my aim. But I'm working with both Joe and Andrew in relation to our policy development and our expenditure review committee.
As a go between them, or? No,
I'm a member of 2 committees now, the Expenditure Review Committee and the Policy Review Committee. And Joe and Andrew are on both. And we're working very hard to come up with policies that will be fully costed and deliverable and appealing to the Australian people for the next election. And our Expenditure Review Committee is going through the budget line by line to find savings, because this government has plunged us into a debt that will probably head north to $200 billion by the time they've finished. And it's awash with wasteful spending. So we're identifying areas of savings where we can make prudent decisions to cut back the wasteful spending and find savings. And Joe and Andrew are both committed to that. I work with them, I observe what they're doing, and they've got a very professional and cohesive relationship.
What about some of the thoughts of Jamie Briggs, who's a pretty high-profile backbencher on the Liberal side? He's involved in trying to find waste and mismanagement on the government side. He wrote an opinion piece today in a section that the Australian Financial Review are now going to make a regular section called the Modest Member section, which Jamie Briggs will be one of 3 rotating authors. Now, he was pretty provocative here. He was highlighting that governments should do only what people can't do for themselves and no more, and he was suggesting that was the push of Tony Abbott's speech at the National Press Club. Would you agree with that characterisation of what Tony Abbott was saying?
Well, that's a quote from Abraham Lincoln, and I believe that Tony Abbott used that quote in his press club speech.
But is that the way that he intends to govern, do you think, this idea that government should only do what people can't do for themselves?
Most certainly, one of our principles is that we should move away from the nanny state. We should move away from over-interference in people's lives. Government should not interfere excessively in people's lives, the way they run their lives, people's businesses. And that will be one of the guiding principles of the Coalition, that government should get out of people's lives and let them get on with what they do best, whether it's running their family or running their business. Government is there as a support, and we want to ensure that the role of government coexists much more appropriately with the private sector, with civil society, than is currently the case.
It'd be remiss of me not to get one more question in about Kevin Rudd, give you a chance to offer some free advice, whether they take it or not, to the Labor Party. Now, is the Liberal Party concerned about a change of leader? Do you have a preference here? Because all the polls suggest that a Kevin Rudd comeback, it might be short-lived, but certainly in that short term, his polling numbers would skyrocket, and your leader isn't exactly popular when you look at his personal ratings.
In fact, it doesn't matter who leads the Labor Party, it's their policies that are so damaging to the Australian economy. So unless there's a radical change of policies and the incoming leader, Kevin Rudd, dumps all Julia Gillard's policies, and that's going to be difficult because most of Julia Gillard's policies are in fact Kevin Rudd's policies, then Labor's woes will remain the same. The Kevin Rudd campaign to be leader is underway. There's absolutely no question. He has a window of opportunity to move against Julia Gillard before the Queensland election by the 22nd of March, which is the last date that we sit until the budget week in May. And from all the chatter I'm getting around Parliament House, and that includes from Labor members of Parliament, it's on. Kevin Rudd will be showing Julia Gillard the same level of loyalty that she showed him back on the 23rd of June 2010. And I expect to see a challenge in the next few weeks. All
right, well, I'm looking at you down the camera, but I'm sure that you're smirking in hope that this happens, because it's not exactly bad for the opposition to have that kind of internal instability on the government side. I appreciate you joining us, Julie Bishop, on this episode of Showdown. Thanks for your company.
My pleasure.
When we come back from the break, we'll be joined by Labor Minister, Special Minister of State, Gary Gray. Back in a moment.
I refer the Prime Minister to the Fair Work inquiry into the Health Services Union that is now in its 4th year, longer than the Watergate inquiry, longer than the Korean War, longer than it took to build Sydney's Olympic Stadium, and longer than the duration even of the Rudd government.
Manager of Opposition Christopher Pyne there lamenting the length of time it's taking for the Fair Work Australia inquiry to delve into its findings and deliver them to the public in relation to, apart from anything else, Craig Thomson it would have an impact on, given the nature of the Parliament. First question to Gary Gray, Special Minister of State, who joins us live out of Parliament House. Now, Mr Gray, thanks for your company.
Thanks, Pete.
Can I just ask you on this? I know it's not your portfolio area, but the opposition's got a point here. I know that they've flip-flopped in terms of blaming you on the one hand for interfering, on the other hand for not interfering enough. But my question is, 4 years is a very long time. It's a fair point, isn't it?
If you're carrying out an investigation in the proper way, then I think you have to accept it will take as long as the process of investigation takes. It's not something that the government should attempt to influence, not something that we are attempting to influence, and something that should be done in the proper way, in the proper amount of time.
Sure, but look, you're a straight talker, I know that, and I'm not suggesting the government should interfere, far from it. I'm more just interested in your view on this. I mean, 4 years is a long time for any investigation, much less one that's relatively narrow in its terms of reference.
I can understand that proposition, but at the same time, the process of investigation is one that is being conducted by Fair Work Australia for a particular purpose. Now, all of the investigatory tools, all of the processes of consideration are entirely in the hands of an independent organisation. It's appropriate they should do it independently. It's appropriate they should take their time to get it right. It's not uncommon for investigations to take many years. There are still investigations that ASIC is involved with in other jurisdictions that take a long time to get to the table. I'm not surprised by that amount of time. I am surprised at the suggestion that somehow the government should accelerate it in order to achieve what? In order to achieve a political objective of the coalition. The real objective is a proper investigation and a proper outcome.
All right, I'll come later in the interview to some questions on Kevin Rudd. I don't think any Labor MP manages to get away from a microphone without getting badgered about that at some point in time. But I want to start in your portfolio area. Now, the independent, and that's important to stress, the Independent Remuneration Tribunal have handed down their views about politicians' pay. This is always a difficult subject for politicians. I've written before about the fact that I think politicians are underpaid and significantly so. But at the end of the day, you're always going to cop flack whether it's a bipartisan position on this independent report or not. Take us through exactly what the changes entail and also the timing, because I would have thought at the moment the public are a bit down on our politicians, and even though pollies deserve more pay, it's perhaps not an opportune time for it to happen, maybe.
Peter, I don't think it's ever opportune to deal with these issues. But what has happened over the course of the last 4 years is an audit inquiry into MPs. That then produced an inquiry by the Remuneration Tribunal, augmented by a couple of other people, the Belcher inquiry, that made recommendations in early 2010. From then, we've had a process of consideration by the government, and then the deliberate acknowledgement of the principal recommendation of Belcher, which was to establish for the independent tribunal the capacity to assess and then determine politicians' pay. In the past, the Remuneration Tribunal has only ever made recommendations. Those recommendations have always then been subject to political debate, point scoring and lowest common denominator outcomes.
Well, and in fairness, including by Kevin Rudd, when he determined in the middle of the GFC that he wasn't going to give pollies a pay increase, I mean, that was a classic example of that, wasn't it?
I think it was, and so let me start at that point. When that decision was made to not pass on a properly constructed $5,000 pay rise, when it was rejected, it actually wasn't at the time of the GFC. It was early in 2008, February of 2008. Peter, I can remember it well because the caucus had met to discuss the leader's proposition, and at exactly that time I was called into the chamber to give my first ever speech. By the time I'd finished my speech, I'd told my pay had been cut by $5,000. So I figured it must have been a pretty lousy first speech.
Is this one of the is this one of the reasons maybe why we hear that Kevin Rudd's numbers are overinflated and MPs are getting a bit sick of the media talk about just how many people are following him? You know, they don't want somebody in there that himself, it has to be said, is a multimillionaire who's basically denying them what, in their view, as well as mine, are reasonable pay increases.
Pete, Kevin's made a substantial contribution to this place and a massive contribution to the Labor Party. So I'll get to that later. Let me stay on the salary issue. It's important to have in mind then that there was a gap in how politicians were paid in respect to our reference salary. So when it all got referred to the independent tribunal with the capacity to adjudge what we should be paid, the first thing they did was repair that decision. The second thing that they did was to say, let's have a proper consideration of the work done by an MP. It had not been done since 1988, and prior to that, 1973. In 1988, in Tasmania, a federal seat had 45,000 electors. Currently, in my seat of Brand, I've got over 90,000 electors. It's not possible to presume judgments made on salary, work level and work effort in 1988 were comparable with today's world. And so the tribunal made a judgment that parliamentarians should be paid after independent work which is available on the internet, available to the public, and after submissions from many sources, including the public. They determined, according to the independent study, that a salary band of between $185,000 and over $200,000 was the appropriate level.
And do you think that an increase like that, can I ask you, is important to attracting people into politics, or do you think it's just more about making sure that they're remunerated fairly, but the kind of person that wants to go into politics, it's not about the money anyway?
Peter, I think it's a bit of both. No one comes into politics for the money. No one. I've yet to meet the person who did that. I do meet lots of people who are good people who come into politics and they get a pay rise. I do know lots of people who come into politics and take a pay cut. Mostly people who come into politics to work hard and to work for the greater common good. I've not yet met a person who came in for the money.
You've got to let me ask you a question.
The money will go up.
You've also got to let me ask you a question. You've got an admirer, at least one, on the coalition side. I was talking to a Liberal Party frontbencher this afternoon, and he said, make sure you ask Gary Gray why he isn't running for the Labor leadership. He's one of the only ministers that's successfully gotten some policy reform through the Parliament, or at least will successfully get it through the Parliament.
I can only assume that was a question because he certainly wants the Labor Party to fail. I think I would be the worst leader imaginable under any set of circumstances.
So, sorry, go on.
But I presume that you do want to have a yarn about Labor leadership, so Peter, over to you.
Well, I do, but first I want to just quickly ask you about entitlements, which is also obviously under your general role as Special Minister for State. And Peter Slipper, I mean, now this brings this into stark reality here. Why does the Speaker get a dining room and all of those sort of allowances? Isn't that sort of antiquated, or is that something that you think is reasonable and necessary?
The role of the Speaker is both a functional role that helps the Parliament operate and, in fact, governs parliamentary rules. The role of the Speaker is also ceremonial and practical. And so, on any given day of the week, the Speaker can be playing host to 4, 5, 6, 10 delegations where the Speaker is representing the Parliament. Presidents of the United States visit the Speaker. Members of royal families visit the Speaker.
You comfortable with those sort of level or those calibre of international guests spending time with Peter Slipper?
I'm absolutely comfortable with those people spending time both with Peter Slipper, whom I think's an outstanding Speaker, did a great job today, and the Parliament makes those decisions. It's not for me, as a member of the Parliament, to have a judgment about what a Parliament as a total judges to be the appropriate thing. And the Parliament elected Peter as Speaker.
All right, we're running out of time, so I've got to get to the Labor leadership. Now, there have been attempts by some of your colleagues to suggest that this is just a media beat-up. Now, it may be inconvenient for the Labor Party, but you'd have to concede it's not a simple case of journalists beating this up. It's journalists taking a view based on their conversations with their sources that this is a serious matter now, and don't you think that it needs to be resolved rather than just swept under the carpet by suggesting that this is just the media stirring up tension?
I think it is a serious matter, and it's a serious matter because ultimately it goes to the good governance of the country. And therefore, it's silly of politicians to suggest that somehow the media makes this up. People talk to journalists. I do think it's important to keep that fact in perspective. But at the same time, the government has a busy and difficult agenda. That agenda itself necessarily creates an atmospheric and an environment of challenge, and the Parliament itself makes the process of governing and government unbelievably tough. But we have been remarkably successful. Having said that, it is clearly the case that there are tensions, but it's clearly also the case that we'll manage those, manage our government and manage our Parliament in the best interests of all Australians, and we'll get a balanced budget, a budget surplus this year. That's our priority, as well as jobs, as well as the development of industry, and at the same time implementing our carbon price agenda. Tough ask.
But I'm interested that you say that you'll balance the best interests of the country and your political party here, but you haven't clarified, and you're a straight talker, Mr Gray, is this Julia Gillard or bust till the next election, or are you realistic that she, sure, deserves time, but of course she's on notice, like any politician is, depending on how she goes in the polls this year?
Now, I would never say that this was a matter of balancing the political interests of my party or the country. The interests of the country come first, always will and always should, and in that context, the stability of the Prime Ministership is paramount. And therefore, I believe that over coming weeks and months, the party, the parliamentary party, will again return to its normal even keel and continue the process of good government and good governance.
All right, Gary Gray, Special Minister for State, we appreciate you joining us on this episode of Showdown. Thanks for your company.
Thank you, Peter.
When we come back from the break, we'll be joined by Greens Lower House MP, the first Greens Lower House MP elected at a general election, Adam Band. Back in a moment.
The degree of relentless criticism on this Prime Minister coming from male commentators is probably all subconscious, but is is sexist and quite ridiculous at times.
It's Greens leader Bob Brown speaking yesterday about ridiculous sexism coming from male commentators in the media. To discuss that issue as well as other issues raised by the Greens today is Adam Bant, Greens member in the lower house. Mr Bant, thanks for your company.
Good evening.
I wrote a column on Saturday and again on Sunday being very critical of Julia Gillard's leadership. Am I a double sexist?
No. I don't think the point that Bob Brown was making was at any time the Prime Minister gets criticised by a man or indeed by a woman, but any time that there's criticism, that's sexism. I think what he was pointing to is the very real difference in tone that exists in the way that this Prime Minister, I think, has been treated compared with previous Prime Ministers. And I think it's pretty real, I think it's pretty palpable, and I think a lot of people are feeling it.
I think that there are elements of it. I'd agree with that. I think I've even written about it at different points. But Bob Brown seemed to be casting the net a little bit wider than that in his criticism. It seemed to be that he was trying to bring in a range of male commentators, and that's why I kind of asked the question for him to maybe name names in this respect. Do you really think that it's widespread, or do you think that it's just the odd bad egg in the group?
I think it's an element. I think there's a few. I don't think it's the majority, but I do think it does become a bit of a tone that infects the way a lot of people talk about it. So, for example, we had Mike Willisey asking the Prime Minister whether she often cried. Now, I can't imagine John Howard being asked that question. And John Howard was no friend of the left, and I saw some of the very strong protests that there were against him from widespread sections of the society. I think that when you look at the language that was used there by those criticising the Prime Minister, it pales in comparison to some of the stuff that you see on signs at protests, when you jump on a social media site and look at the way that the current Prime Minister has been attacked. And I think there's an element of either holding to a different standard or perhaps thinking that you can go a bit further and it's fair game, perhaps because she's a woman. And I don't think that infects every criticism, but I do think it's present.
I mean, look, I agree with some of that. We'll move on, but the only thing I'd say, though, is that Prime Minister Howard came in for some pretty strong criticism. I think that comments like calling Julia Gillard a bitch on some of those placards are clear examples of what you would call sexist language. But by the same token, in terms of ferocity, John Howard was variously called a Nazi and a fascist. He was pretty heavily attacked too, but I take the point about it relating not to gender.
That's right. He was fairly heavily attacked, but none of that was about his gender.
Sure.
And I think that there's an element to which it's seen as you can criticise. Of course, you should always be able to, and we should never put limits on the kind of criticism that's made of public officials. But I think this has gone that step further.
Moving on to a question that you asked today in Parliament. You asked the Prime Minister about dental health and the government's commitment to honouring its pledge to bring in a universal scheme there as per what the Greens want. Were you satisfied with her answer?
Well, just to be clear, what we've got is a commitment from the government in the agreement that I and Bob Brown and Christine Milne signed with the Prime Minister and Wayne Swan that talks about stepping towards significant reform and investment in dental health. And we agreed that would be put off a year, and the Treasurer made that point in the last budget, and we're now going to see that we're heading towards significant reform and investment in this year's budget. I'm confident that the Prime Minister and the government is going to deliver on that. The Prime Minister was playing her cards close to her chest today.
I was about to say I read the answer thoroughly, and I got the impression that she was being cautious just in case, depending on how the global economy looks this year.
Well, that may be the case. I mean, we're having some discussions at the moment around how we are going to get dental care into Medicare in the next budget, so that going to the dentist can be like going to the doctor. We are realistic that it's not going to happen in 1 year. We've got a 5-year plan to phase it in. So we're having those discussions, and of course at times they're pretty tough discussions. We're talking about spending a significant amount of money, but in the interest of the Australian people. So we'll see where it goes.
Let me ask you about the private health rebate. Now, the government wants to make the 30% rebate sort of edge away based on income. Fair enough. They also, however, to create, I guess, a carrot or a stick for people to nonetheless, who are wealthy, continue to keep their private health despite the loss of the 30% rebate. They want to impose a higher levy on those people if they are to try to switch out back into the public health system. Now, the Greens oppose this. Isn't that just going to mean that more wealthy people, if they do decide that they don't want to keep paying private health cover, just move back into the public public system because there's no stick, if you like, to prevent them from doing so.
Well, you're right. There's two components to it. There's the means testing component, which is overwhelmingly financially the one that's going to contribute the most to the budget. But on the point of the surcharge, it's in effect a penalty clause for people who don't want to take out private health insurance, and it's a way of forcing them to do that. And I mean, if there was a law that said we're going to charge you extra if you're wealthy, if you choose to send your kid to a public school, instead of sending them to a private school, there'd be an outcry. And I think that's how we should think about this. I don't want to see a two-tier system becoming entrenched in Australia, and I think that's what this will do.
It's interesting, though, because philosophically I can see what you say in the argument that you just ran, but by the same token, pragmatically, I think that the concern of the major parties is that, like it or not, you need these sort of sticks in place, because otherwise the already overburdened public health system is going to cop even more burden.
But it's working in a perverse way at the moment. I mean, in effect, by giving private health rebate, the system that we've got at the moment, you've in fact got low-income earners, through their taxes, giving high-income earners assistance to get things like dental care, which they themselves, the low-income earners, wouldn't be entitled to. And we see this as entrenching that system instead of what should be the priority, which is building a universal, good-quality healthcare system that people will choose, that there would be no need to opt out of because you're getting first-class care in the public system.
Last question, Mr Bank, because we're almost out of time, but Labor people in particular like to often characterise some greens as non-environmental greens as being watermelons, green on the outside but red on the inside. And I asked that on the back of the monthly article where Lee Rhiannon makes the point that essentially the Greens are the closest that you can get to sort of a party that communists could be attracted to. How do you respond to that characterisation of some Greens as being more driven by social issues, I suppose?
Well, I'm not sure that's actually what Lee said, but in the Greens' DNA from the beginning has been commitment to environmental sustainability, peace and non-violence, grassroots democracy and social justice. And all of those things have been there from the beginning. The name the Greens came from when Petra Kelly was out in Australia and saw environmentalists and unionists and workers working together to preserve some significant heritage sites in New South Wales and in Victoria under the name of the Green Bands, and took that back and formed the name the Greens. Those two elements have been central pillars of the Greens forever, so I just don't accept the idea that somehow they're separate. You can't have one without the other.
And we are almost out of time, but you can have tensions between the two. I mean, that's a realpolitik, isn't it?
And look, if you have a political party that's got so many people in it like ours, with more coming on every day, you're going to have a different of opinions. And one of the things that marks us out compared with the old party is that we make decisions by consensus, and that we end up resolving some of those differences of opinion by consensus, and I think that's what makes us so attractive.
All right, Adam Bandt, Greens member for the Lower House, we appreciate you joining us on this episode of Showdown. Thanks for your company.
Thanks very much, Peter.
And thank you for your company. We're right out of time, but we will see you at the same time in a week's time. Thanks for your company. See you then.